When a person stops listening, heaven does not go silent. Instead, it speaks in ways that can no longer be ignored. It speaks through restlessness, through discomfort, through the quiet collapse of routines that once felt safe. And this is where the story begins, not in the moment the person seeks God, but in the moment God decides the silence has lasted long enough. Because there comes a point when the soul drifts too far, and the only thing left to guide it back is a decision that disrupts everything. A decision sent not to punish, but to awaken. He had been living in a rhythm that felt predictable, almost numb. Days blurred into each other, shaped more by habit than intention. There were warnings, small ones, subtle ones. A sense that something was off. A feeling that the path he was walking was becoming too narrow for the weight of who he was supposed to become. But he waved it away. He wasn't ready to listen. Maybe he was afraid of what he would hear. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he had convinced himself that the whisper in his spirit was just imagination. Whatever the reason, he chose silence instead of surrender. And that silence grew heavier with each passing day. But God does not abandon the ones who stop listening. Instead, he waits for the moment when the heart can no longer deny the truth pressing against it. And that moment arrived slowly, like a shadow stretching across the ground, unnoticed until it covered everything. It came through a decision he never planned to make. A choice he didn't want to face. A turning point that felt like it appeared out of nowhere, but had been forming for a long time in the unseen space where heaven does its deepest work. There are decisions that come from logic and decisions that come from fear, but the one God sends is different. It interrupts. It shakes. It exposes the parts of a person they spent years avoiding. And this was one of those moments. He felt it before he understood it, a pressure inside, a stirring that felt like the ground beneath him was giving way. His comfort was cracking. His excuses were trembling. And for the first time in a long time, he could feel something calling him back to himself. It happened on an ordinary day, which is precisely how divine moments often begin. Nothing special. No sign. No revelation. Just a quiet shift inside the heart, a sense that the life he had accepted was no longer compatible with the life he was meant to live. It was uncomfortable, like trying to stay in a room with no air. It wasn't pain exactly, but it wasn't peace either. It was the feeling of being summoned. He ignored it at first, hoping it would fade. But it didn't. It grew louder. He tried distractions. Noise. People. Work. He tried to bury it under routine. But it followed him. It sat with him. It moved with him. And one night, as he lay staring at the ceiling in the dark, he finally understood, this wasn't just anxiety or confusion. This was a divine interruption. When God wants to redirect a life, he doesn't shout. He orchestrates. He rearranges. He lets the things that once satisfied you lose their flavor. He lets doors close that you were never supposed to walk through. He lets certain relationships weaken, not because they were evil, but because they were too small to carry your calling. And he lets the hidden weight inside your chest rise to the surface until denying it becomes impossible. This was the decision forming inside him. A decision he didn't choose, but one that chose him. It had no words yet, no clear shape. Just a pull, strong, unmistakable, like gravity for the soul. And even though he didn't know where it would lead, something inside him whispered that his life was about to change. People think God speaks only through peace, but sometimes God speaks through the discomfort that refuses to leave. Through the heaviness that rests on your spirit when you're living beneath your purpose. Through the strange sense that you are out of alignment with who you are called to be. That was the voice he was hearing now, not loud, but relentless. At first, he wondered if he was losing control. But the truth was the opposite, he was finally being brought back into alignment. He was being brought to the edge of a decision that would define the next chapter of his life. Not a decision about career or relationships or goals. Something deeper. Something internal. A decision about direction, about turning toward the one he had been drifting away from. He didn't realize it yet, but this decision was mercy disguised as disruption. It was a rescue mission. It was the kind of divine intervention that only arrives when a person has reached the place where they cannot hear the whisper anymore. So God sends a moment they cannot ignore. And when it arrived, it felt like the world paused around him. His thoughts stilled. His defenses lowered. His excuses collapsed. For a brief moment, everything became clear. He saw the gap between who he was and who he was becoming. He saw the emptiness he had been carrying. He saw how long he had been running from the truth that was now standing right in front of him. That's when the decision finally revealed itself, quiet, simple, undeniable. Turn back. Not because he was failing, but because he was needed. Not because he was broken, but because he was chosen. Not because he was weak, but because something inside him was meant to awaken. He realized then that this wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a calling. The kind of calling that follows a person until they answer it. The kind of calling that opens the path they were born to walk. And in that moment, in that stillness, in that clarity, he finally understood. The decision God sends when you're no longer listening isn't meant to comfort you. It's meant to transform you. It's meant to pull you out of what is familiar. It's meant to return you to the center of your purpose. It's meant to realign your soul with the destiny you've been avoiding. And as the realization settled into him, he felt something shift, not outside, but within. The silence broke. The numbness cracked. And a new beginning took its first breath inside him. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know how much it would cost. He didn't know how deeply it would change him. But he knew one thing. The decision had been made. Not by him, but in him. And from this moment on, his life would never move in the same direction again. He woke the next morning with a strange stillness inside him, a quiet that felt unfamiliar, as if the noise he had lived with for so long had been suddenly muted. Not silence in the world around him, but silence within, the kind that comes when something deeper than thought begins to move. For the first time in years, he could sense the weight of his own spirit. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't light. It was simply present, demanding to be acknowledged. And that presence made everything else feel strangely distant. He tried to go through his usual routine, but the routine felt hollow. The things he normally did without thinking now felt forced, almost artificial. He brushed his teeth, but his mind wasn't in the motions. He made coffee, but it tasted like nothing. He scrolled through his phone, but every notification felt empty, irrelevant, disconnected from the part of him that had awakened during the night. It was as if something inside him had gone ahead of him, leaving the rest of his life behind. That's how divine decisions work. They shift your internal world before your external world even realizes anything has changed. They create a divide between who you have been and who you are being called to become, long before you understand what that transition will demand. And he could feel that divide growing, a quiet separation between the life he had been living and the life he knew he could no longer ignore. He didn't know what God wanted from him yet. He didn't know what obedience would cost. He didn't know why the stirring inside him felt both urgent and patient at the same time. But he knew he couldn't go back. Something had been set in motion. Something irreversible. Something that required his full attention, even if he didn't yet know how to give it. As he walked through the day, he noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The exhaustion on people's faces. The numbness in their eyes. The way everyone seemed to be moving quickly but aimlessly, running on rhythms that kept them busy but not alive. It was as if the world around him had revealed its hollowness overnight. And for the first time, he understood that he had been living the same way, distracted, disconnected, surviving instead of truly living. That realization didn't make him sad. It made him aware. And awareness is the beginning of transformation. He found himself reflecting on choices he had made, decisions rooted in fear, in convenience, in hesitation. He saw how many times he had ignored the pull of his own purpose. He saw how often he had chosen comfort over calling, distraction over direction, noise over truth. And as he walked, he felt the weight of that recognition settle inside him. Not as guilt, but as clarity. He had been asleep. And now he was waking up. God does not awaken a person all at once. He awakens them gently, layer by layer, truth by truth, until the eyes of the soul can finally see what was always there. And as he moved through the day, he could feel those layers peeling back, not painfully, but necessarily. Like fog lifting from the surface of a quiet lake. At one point, he paused and looked at his reflection in a window. For a moment, he didn't recognize the person staring back. Not because he had changed physically, but because there was something different in his expression, something resolved, something aware, something quietly burning behind the eyes. He had spent so long avoiding himself that truly seeing himself felt like staring at a stranger. He continued walking, and as he did, a thought rose in him with undeniable clarity: you can't live the way you lived before. It wasn't a command. It was a truth. A truth his spirit had accepted even if his mind hadn't caught up yet. A truth that felt like the echo of the decision God had planted inside him. He didn't know where this inner pull was leading him, but he knew it was real. It wasn't emotion. It wasn't impulse. It wasn't random. It was alignment. It was direction. And even though it came with uncertainty, it also carried a sense of peace, not the gentle kind, but the grounded, unshakable kind that comes when the soul recognizes the hand of God. Throughout the day, there were moments when he felt the old version of himself trying to resurface, the part that wanted to retreat into distraction, into routine, into the comfort of not thinking. But every time that temptation came, something inside him pushed back gently yet firmly. It was as if his spirit was whispering, not this time. Not again. Not after everything you've seen. He was becoming someone different. Someone aware. Someone awake. Someone who could no longer accept a life that pulled him away from his calling. That night, as he lay in bed again, the stirring inside him grew stronger. Not chaotic. Not overwhelming. Just present, steady, almost like a heartbeat echoing through his soul. And in that quiet, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of being seen. Not by the world. Not by people. But by God. It wasn't a feeling of exposure. It was a feeling of recognition. As if God was looking at him not with disappointment, but with intention. As if God had been waiting patiently for this exact moment, the moment where his heart became soft enough, quiet enough, open enough to finally hear. And in that darkness, another truth surfaced, clear and undeniable. This decision isn't about where you're going. It's about who you're becoming. He let that truth settle into him. He let it reshape him quietly. Because deep down, he knew it was right. He had spent so much of his life chasing outcomes, chasing answers, chasing clarity, that he had forgotten that God cares far more about the person than the destination. And now, for the first time, he understood that the decision forming inside him was not about arriving somewhere, it was about becoming someone. He didn't sleep quickly that night. He didn't need to. Something inside him was unfolding, rearranging, strengthening. His old identity, the one he had built on fear and habit, was loosening its hold. And a new identity, rooted in purpose, shaped by obedience, was beginning to rise. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know what God would ask of him. He didn't know how the coming days would shape him. But he understood one thing with absolute clarity. He was not going back. He couldn't go back. The decision had already taken root. And once God plants a decision in a person's soul, the only direction left is forward. The next days unfolded with a strange sense of tension, as if his life were stretched between two worlds, the one he had lived in for years, and the one calling him forward with quiet insistence. He moved through ordinary moments, but none of them felt ordinary anymore. A simple conversation felt heavier. A silence felt louder. A choice felt sharper. It was as though his soul had stepped into a new atmosphere while his body was still catching up. He began noticing things he once ignored. Small details. Quiet signs. Subtle shifts. The way certain places drained him. The way certain people pulled him backward. The way certain habits felt like weights he had been dragging without realizing it. It became harder to lie to himself, harder to hide behind routines, harder to stay numb. The decision God had planted in him was exposing everything that no longer aligned with who he was becoming. He didn't ask for this inner confrontation. It simply happened. That's the nature of divine shifts, they reveal the truth not to shame you, but to free you. And truth, once revealed, cannot be unseen. It demands response. It demands realignment. It demands the courage to release what no longer fits. And he was starting to feel that demand growing stronger each day. There were moments where he felt overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what was changing inside him. Not because the change was painful, but because it was deep. Deep enough to shake the foundations of the life he had settled for. Deep enough to challenge everything he thought he understood about himself. Deep enough to make him question whether the person he had been was ever truly him. One morning, he stood in front of the mirror for longer than he expected. He studied his own face, but not with vanity, with curiosity. His eyes looked different. Not brighter, not darker, but more awake. More aware. More grounded in something he couldn't yet define. He saw traces of fear, but also traces of strength. He saw exhaustion, but also a spark that hadn't been there before. It was strange to feel like he was both breaking apart and coming together at the same time. He realized then that transformation isn't clean. It isn't neat. It isn't organized. It's messy and unpredictable. It disrupts rhythms and exposes attachments and demands release. And in that mirror, he recognized that a version of himself was dying, not the true version, but the one he had built to survive. The one made of fear. The one made of hesitation. The one made of pretending. God was not asking him to become someone new. God was stripping away everything that was not truly him. As the day unfolded, he found himself thinking about his past, not with regret, but with clarity. For the first time, he saw how many of his decisions had been shaped by a fear of disappointing people. He remembered moments when he felt the pull of purpose but stepped away because the unknown terrified him. He remembered seasons where he asked God for direction but ignored the answer because it demanded sacrifice. And suddenly, he understood why God had sent this decision now, at this specific moment of his life. He wasn't ready before. He wasn't willing before. He wasn't aware before. But now, he was all three. And once a person becomes aware of their misalignment, remaining misaligned becomes unbearable. That afternoon, he sat outside, watching the sky shift colors. For a moment, everything felt still. And in that stillness, a thought rose within him, gentle but firm: you've been living a life too small for your calling. He didn't know exactly what his calling was yet, but he knew it was bigger than the routines and fears that had shaped him. It was bigger than the excuses he had used to stay comfortable. It was bigger than the identity he had carried like a shield. Calling is never small. Purpose is never quiet. Destiny is never comfortable. He felt the weight of that truth settle into him, not as pressure but as responsibility. Not the heavy kind, but the kind that wakes a person up to their own potential. And suddenly, he realized something he had never considered before: maybe God was not asking him to become someone extraordinary, maybe God was asking him to stop being ordinary on purpose. As evening arrived, he found himself thinking about the decision forming inside him. He still couldn't define it with words. He still couldn't explain it. But he could feel it, unmistakable, alive, growing stronger each day. It felt like a quiet instruction that pulsed inside his chest: turn toward me. Not out of fear. Not out of desperation. But out of alignment. Out of recognition. Out of truth. He had spent so long trying to navigate life with his own strength that he had forgotten how to listen. And now, God was teaching him to hear again, not with his ears, but with his spirit. Not through noise, but through stillness. Not through certainty, but through surrender. Late that night, he stepped outside again. The air was cool, the world was quiet, and the sky was filled with stars that looked like scattered lanterns. And in that silence, something inside him broke open. Not a painful break, a freeing one. A release he didn't even know he had been longing for. He felt his defenses lower. His walls loosen. His fear quiet down. And in that vulnerable space, he whispered, almost without meaning to, "I'm listening." It wasn't a dramatic prayer. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw. Honest. Simple. The kind of admission that only comes from a soul finally ready to surrender. And in that moment, something shifted. Not outside him, but inside. The stirring that had been persistent for days softened, like a storm calming after finally being acknowledged. The pressure lifted. The heaviness eased. It was as if heaven had been waiting for those words. Listening is the gateway to direction. Surrender is the doorway to purpose. Obedience is the path to destiny. And now, for the first time in a long time, he was finally stepping onto that path. He didn't know what God would say next. He didn't know what would be required. He didn't know how this journey would unfold. But he knew he had made the one choice that changes everything. He had stopped resisting. Stopped running. Stopped hiding. He had opened the door. And once the door to truth opens, life can never return to what it was. He didn't notice it at first, the quiet shift inside him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind of sign you would call a miracle. It was more like a pressure in the soul, the kind that comes when something has reached its expiration date. The life he had been living no longer matched the person he was becoming. And God knew it long before he did. This is what happens when someone refuses to listen for too long. Life begins to tighten around them, slowly, deliberately, until staying the same becomes more painful than changing. God doesn't shout. He allows consequences to speak on his behalf. And when the heart resists long enough, he sends one decision that forces movement, a decision that doesn't wait for your comfort or approval. The person felt it now. The restlessness that used to be small had grown into a silent storm. Everything familiar felt suddenly inadequate. The habits that once numbed him no longer worked. The excuses he repeated had stopped convincing even himself. Life was closing in, not to destroy him, but to steer him. A person can drift only so long before divine pressure redirects their path. Inside him, a single question began to rise, not loud, but unavoidable. If I keep living like this, what will I become? It wasn't fear. It was awakening. And awakening always comes with discomfort. Growth never enters softly, it arrives with the weight of what you've avoided. God wasn't punishing him. God was positioning him. The silence he interpreted as abandonment was actually divine strategy. Sometimes, heaven steps back so you can hear the truth inside yourself without interference. He walked through his days with a strange clarity that felt unfamiliar. The conversations he used to tolerate drained him now. The environments he stayed in out of habit felt suffocating. The thoughts he ignored became louder, sharper, unavoidable. Everything around him remained the same, yet everything inside was shifting. This is how God prepares someone for a decision they can no longer avoid. It happens slowly, then all at once. One night, he sat in the quiet, a place he usually avoided because silence exposed everything he buried. But this time he didn't run. Something held him there. A weight he couldn't explain. A pull he couldn't resist. It wasn't fear. It was conviction forming in the dark. In that silence, he realized the truth. He had been surviving, not living. Reacting, not choosing. Moving, but not progressing. Breathing, but not awakening. And God had waited patiently for him to see it. When someone refuses to listen, God doesn't always send warnings. Sometimes he sends a decision, one that will confront their patterns, challenge their comfort, and disrupt their illusions. This decision doesn't negotiate. It doesn't ask if you're ready. It arrives when your soul is starving for change. For him, the decision came wrapped in a moment that felt ordinary but carried divine weight. A thought that didn't feel like his own whispered through his mind. If you don't choose now, life will choose for you. It hit deeper than he expected. Because he knew it was true. Everything he feared losing was already slipping from his hands. Everything he hoped for was already calling him. And there he stood, between two realities, the life he was used to, and the life he was created for. The distance between them was one decision. One act of courage. One surrendered moment. He realized something God often waits for humans to understand. Change doesn't begin when conditions improve. Change begins when obedience overrules fear. He looked at his life with a clarity he never allowed before. The patterns that held him back were obvious now. The relationships that drained him were no longer disguised as comfort. The habits that slowed him were no longer defendable. Every lie he told himself dissolved under the weight of truth. This is what divine turning points feel like, not dramatic, not loud, but deeply undeniable. As he sat there, breathing in a way he hadn't in years, something inside him shifted from resistance to readiness. Not confidence, not certainty, just readiness. And sometimes, that's all heaven needs to move. God wasn't asking him to understand the entire path. He wasn't asking for perfection. He wasn't demanding flawless faith. He was asking for one thing. A decision. Not tomorrow. Not when he felt stronger. Not when he felt prepared. Now. Because when a person is no longer listening, God sends a moment they can't ignore. A moment that changes everything. A moment that divides a life into before and after. And he could feel that moment unfolding. He wasn't running from it anymore. He wasn't hiding behind excuses. He wasn't negotiating with destiny. For the first time in a long time, he whispered to himself, not as a wish, but as a vow. I'm done avoiding who I'm supposed to become. And heaven heard it. Even if the world didn't. The shift had begun. The path was opening. The old identity was collapsing. The decision was forming, the one God had been preparing him for all along. He woke up the next morning with a strange clarity, quiet but unmistakable. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't confidence. It was something deeper, something steadier. The kind of inner stillness that comes only after a soul finally stops lying to itself. He didn't know exactly what he was stepping into, but he knew he couldn't remain where he had been. Not spiritually. Not mentally. Not emotionally. The old version of him was too small for the weight he was meant to carry. This is what people rarely understand. Before God gives direction, he creates tension. Not to break you, but to break what has been holding you back. The person walked through his day almost as an observer of himself. He could see the patterns that once controlled him, but he no longer felt trapped inside them. The temptations, distractions, and impulses that usually pulled him off track felt weaker now, almost powerless. Not because the world had changed, but because he was no longer listening to the same inner voice he used to obey. He felt the shift like a quiet fire burning in his chest, not destructive, but purifying. It was as if something inside him whispered. You already know the truth. Now act on it. The decision God sends is never random. It arrives at the exact moment your soul can no longer tolerate the version of you that avoids responsibility. And this was that moment for him. The moment where truth becomes heavier than fear. The moment where silence becomes instruction. The moment where destiny stops being an idea and becomes a demand. He could feel God removing the excuses from his mind one by one. He could feel heaven interrupting every thought of postponement. He could feel clarity rising like a voice that had always been there but he never made time to hear. And for the first time in years, he didn't resist. He sat with the truth, even though it stung. He acknowledged his patterns, even though they embarrassed him. He faced his fears, even though they felt bigger than his strength. But this time, something was different. He felt supported. Not by people. Not by motivation. Not by hope alone. But by conviction. God wasn't asking him to leap blindly. God was asking him to stop retreating. There's a difference. He walked into the evening feeling the weight of an invisible instruction, one he still couldn't fully articulate, but he could feel it forming in him like a pulse. The decision wasn't fully clear yet. But its presence was undeniable. It felt like God was saying, "You're ready to stop surviving. Now choose to live." He looked around at the life he had created out of habit, fear, and hesitation. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a room he had outgrown. A version of himself he could no longer fit into. Every part of his old identity felt too tight, too limiting, too shallow for what God was awakening inside him. As the night deepened, he sat alone in a dimly lit room. The air felt heavier, almost sacred. This wasn't just reflection anymore. This was confrontation. The kind that forces a person to stand face to face with the truth they've avoided. And he didn't look away this time. He whispered quietly, but with more honesty than he had used in years. "I don't want to keep living like this." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was real. And heaven responds to what is real. The room around him felt different, as if something unseen leaned closer. Not to frighten him, but to steady him. To remind him that this wasn't a moment of loss. It was a moment of transfer. The ending of one identity, and the beginning of another. He understood something profound then. God doesn't wait for you to be ready. He waits for you to be honest. Once honesty appears, direction follows. The decision began forming more clearly now. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a realization that had been waiting inside him for years, buried beneath fear and excuses. He needed to leave something behind. He needed to release something that had held him. He needed to step into a chapter that terrified him because it demanded growth. God was calling him out of what was killing him slowly. He stared at the reality he didn't want to face. Every delay had cost him something. Every excuse had closed another door. Every fear had stolen time he could never recover. And yet, he wasn't condemned. He was being redirected. He felt the presence of God not as comfort, but as pressure, holy pressure. The kind that doesn't let you stay where you are. The kind that forces awakening. The kind that marks the soul with a sense of urgency that no distraction can erase. He breathed in slowly, deeply, tasting the weight of the moment. He wasn't afraid of the future anymore. He was afraid of wasting it. And that fear was pure. It was holy. It was the fear that begins transformation. He whispered again, but this time with authority. "I choose the path you've been showing me." The words shook him. Not because they were loud. But because they were true. He felt something break inside him, not in a painful way, but in a liberating one. The internal resistance that had kept him stuck began to crumble. The fear that controlled his decisions loosened its grip. The doubt that once defined him began to lose its voice. This was the beginning of obedience. Not perfect obedience. But willing obedience. And willing obedience is enough to unlock destiny. He didn't know how everything would unfold. He didn't need to. He finally understood the one thing God had been waiting for. Faith is not certainty. Faith is movement. And now, he was ready to move. Ready to leave what had drained him. Ready to walk toward what he couldn't yet see. ready to step into the identity God had been shaping in silence. The decision was no longer forming. It was forming him. And heaven waited patiently for his next step. Because one decision opens the door. But courage walks through it. He felt it before he fully understood it, the shift from internal decision to external consequence. The moment a person truly chooses a new direction, life begins to rearrange itself around that choice. Paths open. Paths close. People drift away. Opportunities appear that were invisible before. Not because the world changed, but because he changed. And change in the soul always ripples outward. The next morning, everything around him felt strangely unfamiliar. The room was the same, the streets were the same, the sky was the same, yet nothing felt the same. It was as if he had stepped into a version of his life where he was finally awake. Not fully awakened, but no longer asleep. His mind was sharper, his emotions clearer, his heart quieter. This is what happens when a person aligns with the truth God has been whispering into their spirit for years. He didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel ready. But he felt aligned. And alignment is more important than readiness. He walked through the day with a strange awareness, seeing things he once overlooked, feeling things he once ignored. Old patterns tried to pull him back, but they no longer fit him. He could sense the internal battle rising, not as chaos, but as clarity. Because once a soul decides to move forward, the old self doesn't die quietly. There's always resistance. There's always an echo of the past trying to reclaim what it once controlled. He felt those echoes, the doubts, the memories, the fears, but this time they didn't dominate him. They passed through him like voices fading in a long hallway. He didn't fight them, he simply let them lose their power. In that quiet surrender, something sacred emerged, a sense that he wasn't walking alone. Not anymore. Not like before. He could feel a presence moving with him, not pushing, not dragging, but guiding. It wasn't emotional. It was structural, like the invisible architecture of a path that had been waiting for him. As evening approached, he felt drawn to silence again. Not the painful silence he used to avoid, but a holy silence, the kind that prepares the soul for instruction. He sat with a slowness he had never allowed himself, breathing deeply, letting his thoughts settle into stillness. It was then that he understood something he had never seen clearly before. Obedience isn't a single choice. It's a posture. A stance. A way of being. The decision he had made wasn't the finish line, it was the doorway. And now he stood inside the threshold, feeling both the weight of what was behind him and the call of what lay ahead. He knew God was guiding him into a chapter he had feared for years, a chapter that demanded honesty, discipline, and courage. Not the dramatic kind of courage people admire publicly, but the quiet courage that no one sees. The courage to stay consistent. The courage to break patterns. The courage to rebuild his identity from the inside out. This was the work God had been preparing him for. As he sat there, something settled in his spirit, a recognition that transformation would not happen by accident. It would require daily alignment, daily surrender, daily decisions that cost him something. Growth is never free. And God never hides that truth. He felt a heaviness in his chest, not painful, but sobering. A reminder that he had wasted time. A reminder that he had ignored signs. A reminder that he had delayed obedience for far too long. But alongside that heaviness, there was a quiet mercy, the realization that God wasn't holding the past against him. God was simply refusing to let him stay the same. He whispered quietly into the dim light. I'll keep going. Even when I'm afraid. The words weren't dramatic, but they were honest. And honesty is what heaven responds to. Something softened inside him, a release, a loosening of the chains he had placed on himself. He felt the truth expanding in him. He didn't need to be fearless. He just needed to be willing. And willingness began to reshape him. He felt the presence of God draw near in a way that didn't feel comforting, it felt commissioning. Like something was being entrusted to him. Like a mantle was being laid on his shoulders. Not a calling he could brag about, but a calling he would have to carry. He realized that the decision wasn't simply about changing direction. It was about becoming someone capable of sustaining that direction. This was why God had waited until now, because a decision without transformation collapses under pressure. And God wasn't guiding him into a moment. God was guiding him into a life. The person inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the realization settle into his bones. He finally understood the purpose of all the inner tension, the silence, the pressure, the discomfort. It wasn't punishment. It was preparation. Because when a person stops listening, God doesn't send noise. He sends necessity. He sends opportunity disguised as discomfort. He sends a decision that demands responsibility. And now he was ready for it. He stood up slowly, with the awareness that the next chapter would not be easy, but it would be meaningful. Every step forward would demand discipline. Every choice would carry weight. Every moment of hesitation would try to pull him backward. But backward was no longer an option. He whispered again, this time with more strength. I will not go back. The room seemed to breathe with him. Not metaphorically, spiritually. It was as if heaven responded to his vow with its own stillness. A confirmation. A marking. A beginning. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt responsible. And responsibility was the very thing his soul had been avoiding for years. Now it was his ally. He stepped forward, not physically, but internally. A step into a new identity. A step into maturity. A step into obedience. A step into becoming the person God had intended before the world distracted him into smaller versions of himself. The decision was no longer an idea. It was no longer a moment. It was becoming a lifestyle. And God was already preparing what would meet him on the other side of that transformation. He woke before the sun, long before the world around him had opened its eyes. For a moment, he didn't move. He just lay there, listening to the stillness of the early morning, a silence that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt inhabited. Thick. Purposeful. As if something sacred waited in the quiet, ready to speak the moment he chose to listen. And this time, he was listening. He sat up slowly, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of who he used to be. The old identity that clung to him like a shadow no longer felt attached. It felt like something he had walked out of, like a room he had finally left behind. He understood now. The moment you accept God's decision for your life, your past loses its authority. He stood and walked to the window. The sky was still dark, but a faint line of light was beginning to push through the horizon, steady and determined, the same way his soul now moved inside him. The same way truth rises after being buried under years of avoidance. He realized something profound in that moment. God doesn't wait for your perfection. God waits for your permission. Once you give it, even in weakness, even in fear, heaven begins to move around you. As the first hint of dawn spread across the sky, he could feel it, the unmistakable shift that happens when a person aligns themselves with what they were created for. Not the life they settled for. Not the identity they performed. But the truth they were designed to carry. His mind wandered to the past few days, the tension, the silence, the realization, the breaking, the choosing. None of it had been easy. But every moment had been necessary. He understood now that God had not been ignoring him. God had been waiting for him to stop running. Because a person who is always running can't receive direction. He closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, letting the last fragments of the old version of himself leave his body with that breath. Not as a dramatic moment, but as a release of something he no longer needed to hold. And then he heard it, not externally, not audibly, but internally, like a voice carried on the breath of his spirit. Walk. Just that. One word. Simple. Clear. Unmistakable. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't encouragement. It wasn't comfort. It was a command. God doesn't give you all the details. God gives you a direction. And direction is enough. He felt something shift inside his chest as he accepted that one word. It was as if the ground beneath him became more solid, as if heaven had placed a foundation under his feet. He wasn't stepping into the unknown anymore, he was stepping into alignment. He whispered back, barely audible, but heavy with truth. I will. And in that moment, something ancient stirred around him, not fear, not excitement, but destiny. The kind of destiny that doesn't arrive loudly, but unmistakably. The kind that feels like a weight and an invitation at the same time. He walked through the quiet house, each step feeling more intentional than the last. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't hesitating. He was simply obeying. And obedience had already begun to change him. He reached the door and paused. Not because he was unsure, but because he understood the magnitude of this moment. This was the first step of the rest of his life. Not metaphorically, spiritually. He placed his hand on the doorknob and felt the world outside waiting for him, not as an enemy, but as a mission. Not as chaos, but as territory. Not as uncertainty, but as calling. He opened the door. The cold morning air hit his face, sharp and cleansing, like a baptism from the outside world. It reminded him of something important. God's decisions for your life require movement. Not internal movement. Not emotional movement. Physical movement. You cannot stay where you were and become who you are meant to be. He stepped outside. One step. But heaven counts differently. To God, that was not a step. That was a response. And heaven responds to response. He looked up at the sky, now streaked with faint lines of early sunlight. He didn't know where this path would lead. He didn't know what challenges would appear. He didn't know how many moments of doubt would rise again. But he knew one thing with unshakable clarity. He would not go back to sleep. Not spiritually. Not mentally. Not emotionally. He had awakened. And once the soul awakens, it cannot return to pretending. He walked slowly, but with purpose, letting clarity settle inside him with each step. He could feel the decision God had placed in his life unfolding like a map inside his chest, not revealing every detail, but guiding him through instinct, conviction, and peace. He thought about all the times he ignored the signs, the whispers, the warnings. All the times he convinced himself he wasn't ready. All the times he chose comfort over calling. But today, none of that defined him. Today, obedience defined him. Today, alignment defined him. Today, courage defined him, not loud courage, but the quiet, unshakable courage of someone who finally understands their purpose. He stopped walking. Not because he was lost, but because he had reached a realization he had been avoiding for years. The decision God sends is not about what you will do. It's about who you will become. And he was becoming the person he was created to be. He breathed deeply and let a new truth settle into his bones. I accept the calling. Not the fantasy. Not the idea. Not the dream. The calling. And heaven heard it. Something lifted from him, the last remnants of doubt, fear, and hesitation. He didn't need confirmation anymore. He didn't need signs. He didn't need emotional proof. Faith was enough. He turned his face toward the rising sun, and the early light washed over him like a promise, quiet, steady, unbreakable. This was the moment everything shifted. This was the moment destiny started. This was the moment he finally said yes. Not to comfort. Not to clarity. But to God. And one decision, the decision he had avoided for years, had finally rewritten his entire life.